For tonight's weed management for pastures, we have J.D. Greene, who has begun his professional career at the University of Kentucky, where he has over 34 years in experience as an extension weed scientist. His major job responsibilities include developing and disseminating weed control strategies that impact Kentucky's major field and forage crops. Dr. Greene's research has focused on weed control strategies to deal with troublesome weeds that affect these agriculture land issues. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Greene.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, again, I want to appreciate this opportunity to share with you some this evening on dealing with weed control issues as we focus on pastures and hayfields this evening. I don't claim to have all the answers for all the issues that we deal with in these particular forage crop settings, if you will, but I hope to leave you with what I consider some few nuggets, some things to think about, or things you might be able to incorporate to some things you're already doing to deal with some of these problematic weed issues that you deal with, because there's always the complexities of the issues that we deal with, and particularly the complexities as we deal with some of these forage crop issues. As we start thinking about this topic tonight, one of the things that intrigues me as I drive around Kentucky and other parts of the country is a lot of scenes that look like this, in which we have a fence line, and on one side of the fence, the vegetative growth is different than the other side of the fence. And it should be pretty obvious to most of us as to which one is a grazed pasture field and which one is more likely a hay field. But for the most part, I doubt that there's very much difference, at least in soil type or soil characteristics, within that immediate landscape on both sides of that fence. But certainly the vegetation that's present is quite different from one fence to one area to the next. And why is that? Well, a lot of that has to do with how those fields have been utilized over the last several years, over the previous years. And unfortunately, to try to get this field on the left to look as like the field on the right may take a few more years to revert it back to a situation that would be much more desirable. It's not to say there's not any weeds over there where the hayfield is, because I suspect there is, but the type of weeds they are and how they grow can be different oftentimes, depending on how that land area has been utilized. So what are some overall factors that promote weed problems? Well, we can think of several different factors that play into weeds and their existence in various landscapes, but I think it boils down to two primary principles. One is the environment. Certainly the plants that we might find on an upland site will differ sometimes and what may be more prominent in a lowland or area that stays wet for extended periods of time. And the other, as well as dry years versus wet years, as far as the type of weeds that might persist in a given season, can be impacted just on the more annual changes in the weather cycles that we have. But probably the bigger category is those management practices, and those are the things that we do or perhaps don't do, and how they may impact the vegetation that exists on a lot of these landscapes. And I want to try to delve into that a little bit more here in a few moments. But as we start thinking about that, one of the primary things that I see, and it's pretty obvious, is where do you have a lot of your major weed problems? Oftentimes they're in those areas where we have a lot of animal traffic, feeding areas especially, particularly where we're feeding during the winter months. These are areas that get a lot of foot traffic, a lot of open bare spots, and what's going to grow in those open bare spots? Oftentimes they're going to be occupied by weeds, particularly annual weeds, or even some perennial weeds that begin to get a foothold into those areas and become much more problematic. Whereas we have a field that has a lot of good stand of desirable grasses, then it's less so. So overall, I think one of the important things to think about is the effect of grazing on pastures, especially if that grazing is selective defoliation. These animals are just like us. We go through the buffet line. We're going to take what we like and leave what we don't like. And so we're selecting. We're taking out those desirable forage species that they like, and it puts that selection pressure on those desirable forage species as they're being utilized, and we get this shift more towards the undesirable species, particularly those undesirable species that are left in those grazed environments. They reproduce, produce more seed, or build up their root system, and those unpalatable species like the thistles, the ironweed, ragweed, and so forth become much more dominant on that landscape over time. Now, certainly one of the ways that we can have a little bit of influence on this is altering our livestock stocking rates, trying to match the stocking rate for the type of forage that we have and the amount of forage that we have available to us, the timing as to when we graze, and certainly the animal species themselves. We know that horses graze different than cattle, and certainly goats graze and utilize some plants that are not being utilized by cattle and horses. So all those are all factors that play into this idea of selectivity relative to animals removing the desirable species, the desirable forages, and leaving the ones that are left alone. In fact, I did a survey several years back here in Kentucky, and I polled the county agents, ag and natural resource agents across the state, and asked them to rank the top 5 weeds in their county and rank them 1 to 5. And whenever I got my results back and started putting it together, things like tall ironweed and musk thistle, the buttercup, spiny amaranth, cocklebur, even multiflora rose at that time, the ragweed, horse nettle, and even bull thistle were at the top of the list, the top 10 or so weeds that were reported as being the more problematic weeds that we had in grass pastures. And as I got to looking at that list, it really points out these are the plants that animals typically do not graze, whether it be due to physical structures on the plant that prohibits the animal to graze them, whether it be thorns or spines on the leaves, and or they just don't like to eat them. If we can get animals to eat tall ironweed, we could produce a lot of biomass. But for some reason, that is not a plant that's desirable for those animals to consume. So what is the overall impact of weeds? Well, there's 3 main categories. One, it can reduce forage quantity, the amount of forage that we have available. And I'm going to show you some data here in a few minutes that helps illustrate that point in regards to the impact weeds can have on forage quantity. It can also impact the forage stand life. As these plants are crowding out the desirable forages, it's going to reduce the amount of forage we have there, as well as diminish the quality and or the palatability of the forage mix that we have available for those animals to graze. But having said all of that, it's kind of identified our problem. What's the tools in the toolbox for control? Well, unlike our grain crops, where we depend a lot on herbicides as our primary tool for control, I think for weed control in our forage-based crops, we have a number of different tools in the toolbox that we can utilize and should be utilizing for controlling some of these unwanted plants. And here's kind of my quick list of those, and I'll go into detail a little bit more here in a moment. But then first of all, the cultural practices. That again is the management side of things, the things that we can do. Mechanical control is probably one of the bigger tools that is often used to suppress weed growth in pasture fields. And then we have some herbicide options, particularly for broadleaf weeds in our grass pastures in hayfield situations. And then there's a few examples of biological agents. I'm going to share an example of one insect that helps us with control of thistles. But also you can think about those goats as a biological control agent if we want to use goats as a way to browse and deal with some of the shrubby species like multiflora rose and so forth that can have an impact on some weeds. And then another one that we kind of snuck in there a little bit is called prevention, and that's not allowing something to get established, because once some of these plants get started and get a foothold and then allowed to continue to propagate, then we have a much bigger problem to deal with. And one of the examples I like to use with prevention is, oftentimes we may be need to purchase hay from adjacent farms or even farms out of state. in order to get through those winter months. But are we guaranteed that that's weed-free hay? Most likely, most hay we utilize has some weeds in it. Now, that's not to say that we're always going to have a problem. We utilize that hay, but sometimes we might bring something other in on the farm that we don't want to get established. Another is just moving around mowing equipment from one farm to the next or field to field can also propagate or move some weed seed to other areas. So that's kind of the quick overview of that. And let's go back and talk about cultural practices or the management side of things. As through the years, as I've thought about this, I'm just about convinced that these cultural practices and management is 50, if not 60% more of weed control for these forage crops. And that's the things that we can do to promote the growth of the desirable species that we'd like to have in those areas. Now, having said that, I know that we do have some landscape areas, you do, and as well as we have in Kentucky. It doesn't matter what we do management-wise, they're rocky outcrops or hillside areas that we're not going to modify that base resource that we have to work with. But there are some areas where if we are doing some routine soil testing to be sure our fertility is where it needs to be, or particularly the soil pH, to maximize the nutrient availability of our desirable species so that they can have the upper hand to utilize that, those basic nutrients for active growth is important. And there are situations where spending our resources on interseeding and thickening up these forage stands may be better spent than trying to find a quick fix of just trying to eliminate the problem, let's say with a herbicide. But there are many cases, weeds can be the indicator that it's time that we need to be thinking about doing some interseeding and doing some practices, try to thicken up the stand of the desirable species we'd like to have. And then particularly for hay production, we need to try to avoid cutting the forage grasses for hay at ground level. And that may be an extreme that I've listed there, but basically the point I'm getting at is in a hay field, when we have our flush of growth in the spring of the year, there's a lot of weeds we don't see because they haven't germinated yet. But just as soon as we remove that top growth and allow sunlight to hit the ground, that helps trigger weed seed germination. So a lot of these weed seed need moisture and they need the temperature, obviously, to trigger germination, but they also need the appropriate amount of light or the sunlight to hit that soil or where those seed are laying just right underneath the soil surface. That helps trigger germination. So if we remove all that top growth and don't leave much cover, that's more sunlight hitting the ground. The other point about cutting it close to the ground is by cutting these grasses real close to the ground, we're also putting a lot of extra stress on those grasses in which they've got to recover. And if they're greatly stressed and has to use a lot of their carbohydrate resources in the roots to produce more top growth, then they're not going to be very competitive against any of the weeds that may come up as that area begins to rebound in its overall growth. So keep in mind, the cutting height does matter, even as it relates to weed control. So basically what I'm getting at is how do we utilize our overall management practices or other activities that promotes the growth of the desirable forage species. That is in itself a way to at least try to push the competitive edge more towards a desirable species and less so towards the weedy species. And that brings us to grazing practices that I sort of alluded to earlier. One of the dilemmas we have in the spring of the year, we have more grass than maybe animals. And sometimes we're having a hard time keeping up with trying to keep it all grazed. But as we move into the summer particularly as it gets hot and dry, then we start having the reverse in which we have more animals than we have grass to sustain them. And then we're forced to continue to graze that as these animals are trying to seek out something to forage on. These weedy plants continue to grow. They have deeper root systems in some cases, or they are able to tolerate those environmental conditions better. And then they are able to propagate, reproduce, and again, we get that shift more toward the undesirable species. And that's a tough call, I know, because at some point in time, when do you start culling a few animals or trying to find other areas for them to graze. One of the things I like about rotational grazing systems is that it does allow some of these areas to get a little bit of a rest, again, to create a competitive advantage more towards the desirable plants than the weedy type plants. Although we may need to clip those off as they've selectively grazed, but at least we do give that area rest as those animals are grazing. Of course, as mentioned, the big tool in the toolbox is mowing or clipping pastures. This certainly removes the top growth of unwanted vegetation, and it can help in some scenarios decrease the population of some of these annual weeds if we can get it mowed before viable seed can be produced. Now, that's not a 1 year or 2 year quick fix, but it's a numbers game in regards to the weed seed that's being produced year to year in which things propagate. As far as perennials, they can be impacted by mowing, particularly to remove that top growth. We'd have to do a lot of frequent mowing to help deplete root reserves, but it may not change the population of the weeds that are there, but we could certainly maybe suppress top growth. But I think the key question about mowing is not the fact that we mow, but is when do you mow? Timing is a key. Now, having said that, that's easier for me to say than to implement sometimes, because we have weedy plants. The cool season plants are producing flowers and reproducing in the spring of the year. We have some plants that are in the reproductive phases during the middle of summer, and then we have other plants that are more in the reproductive phases in the late summer or fall. But the point is depending on what weed problems are most problematic to you, selecting the right time to mow may create more dividends in the long run, although it may not be as obvious at the time we do it. But timing is important, not the fact that we do it beyond just aesthetics purposes, but we're trying to reduce the amount of new seed being produced in a lot of cases. Now, in regards to herbicides, most of the herbicides we have are for broadleaf weeds. We really don't have what I consider a good selective herbicides to control grasses out of grass pastures, but broadleaf weeds there are. The largest group in the bunch are the 2,4-D based products. And I'm talking about 2,4-D by itself. We can get those in either a 2,4-D ester or 2,4-D amine formulations are the two more common formulations available to us. I often get the question is, what's the difference between an ester versus an amine? Well, the ester are the side chains that are attached to the main 2,4-D acid molecule. And if you have an ester attached to the 2,4-D molecule, that formulation tends to go into the leaves quicker than an amine formulation will just on a general comparison basis. But at the same time, the esters are more volatile than the amine formulation. So depending on what your exact situation is as to whether or not you want to choose an amine versus an ester. Now, there is a newer formulation, the 2,4-D choline salt of 2,4-D, that's now in the marketplace. It's being sold as Freelex, that has a label for use on grass pastures. It's not as widely available yet for general use, but it is being used somewhat in the right-of-way areas. So that's 2,4-D, which is in a lot of the products that we have available to us. The dicamba-based herbicides, we typically don't use dicamba by itself, but with dicamba plus 2,4-D mixtures and things like Weedmaster, Rifle D, Brash is just to name a few of the products that are dicamba based. And then we have the triclopyr based herbicides. Triclopyr 2,4-D is Crossbow, sold as a couple other different herbicide names now. If you use triclopyr fluroxapyr, which is what's in Pasture Guard, and as many of you may know, triclopyr based herbicides we use a lot more on some of the woodier type plants, although it can help us on some of the herbaceous, more difficult herbaceous weeds as well. And then we have the aminopyrrolid based herbicides. We typically don't use aminopyrrolid by itself, such as Milestone, but the aminopyrrolid with 2,4-D initially was marketed as Forefront, now being sold as Grazed Next. Then we have a metsulfuron aminopyrrolid, which was been around for a few years, called Chaparral. And then the newest one introduced last year was aminopyrrolid plus fluropyroxafen. So that herbicide doesn't have 2,4-D, but all those chemistries except metsulfuron are growth regulator type products. and it's being sold as a product called Duracor. And as far as control is concerned, Duracor basically controls a lot of the same weeds that we get out of Grazed next. Now, some of you may have heard of another product that's not yet on the market called Proclova, and it has that fluoroperoxifate in it with 2,4-D, and it's not yet available to us, and they are claiming tolerance at least of white clover and annual Lespedeza, but they're not claiming tolerance for the red clover species, which makes sense with the 2,4-D being in there. And then we have straight metsulfuron. We don't use that by itself as much, at least not in our state. It used to be sold as Cimarron, even before it's called Ally, but it's a non-growth regulator type chemistry. And then another new one that we're starting to use some here in Kentucky is Sharpen. Some of you that may grow corn or soybeans may recognize Sharpen as a herbicide we can use on grain crops, but it now has a label for use on grass pasture areas. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Do herbicides work, or can they help us? Certainly they can reduce the weed population. This is a demonstration trial I did for a field day a few years back. I sprayed different strips of different herbicides. These were treated in May, and then this photo was taken in September. And here's a treated area, and then outside the treated area, here's what the area looked like, or the overall field looked like. And then the question I often raise is, which would you rather have? This, where you have few weeds, or this area where we have lots of weeds? And there's a variety of different species that's in this particular field. One of the dilemmas is, as some of you know, I don't know how well you can see it on your screens here, but we have a plant up here in the foreground that's have these red flowers, and that's red clover. And that is a dilemma because we don't have the red clover where we did our herbicide treatments. But I think the ultimate question is, which of those two areas give you the most forage to graze? Which provides you the most forage to utilize in regards to grazing animals, or in the case if it was a hayfield, producing the most hay. Well, I did do another trial here just a few years back up in Northeast Kentucky in an area that was dominated by tall ironweed. We went in and sprayed some herbicide strips randomly and left some unsprayed strips in this field. And the photo you're looking at is 1 year after the treatment. And I want to emphasize that 1 year after the treatment, which occurred in I think it was late July. And we came in and we cut out some subsamples out of our treated strips and out of our untreated strips. And we combined those together. Well, first of all, we separated out the desirable grasses from the weeds. And then we took them back and dried them down to dry weight basis. And here's the results. So we used Grazed next, which is the green bar here, and the red bars represent the untreated. This is a measurement of the biomass dry weight on a pound per acre basis. And as you can see, between the total biomass produced on both areas, one sprayed and one unsprayed, was about 2,000 pounds of dry matter per acre with this one-time sampling. Yes, it looks like there's a little bit more there where the untreated was, but statistically there's no difference here in those numbers. If we look at the forage grasses produced on those areas, we had about 1,000 pounds produced on the untreated area and nearly 2,000 pounds on the treated area. Where's the difference? It's mostly in this tall ironweed and a little bit of horse nettle that was in this field. So what this to me illustrates is how competitive, or how much the tall ironweed is removing the ability of that plant to produce forages to graze. Now, having said that, this field may be more of an extreme. That may not be the case for most of the fields that you have, but it does illustrate that weeds do compete against the amount of forage that we can produce, and removing that weed competition in itself may provide more dividends than anything else that we can do. Again, this may be more, not every field is going to respond this dramatically, but in the case where we had a field that was heavily dominated by tall ironweed, that was the case. Now, spoken a little bit about herbicides, but there are some issues, obviously, that limit herbicide use in grass pastures. And as you go down this list here, the first and foremost I've already mentioned is that those herbicides, for all practical purposes, they at least cause significant damage or partial damage to clover. So where we're trying to grow legumes with our grasses, that's a real dilemma for us, because those herbicides are also going to impact those clovers. But I think other factors is just as important to think about is the timing of the treatment for using herbicides. Oftentimes we fail to see the problem until after the fact, or until they're in full bloom. These weeds are in the reproductive stages, and then we decide we need to do something other. Well, at that point in time, most of our herbicides are going to be more effective when they're in the vegetative growth stages to give us the most benefit. And then we have to be aware of what's growing nearby, whether it's our own farm or somebody else's homestead, because we have sensitive vegetation growing, particularly in the middle of the summer. We may be limited on whether or not we can use a herbicide. We need to think about grazing restrictions. Now, most beef animals, or most of these herbicides for beef animals, have no waiting period, which is good. It allows us to spray if we need to and still let the animals graze. But if you have a field that has a potentially toxic plant, then it probably is not going to be a good idea it'd be a good idea to get those animals out of that field for a time until those plants actually die. We think about cost of treatment. Some of these herbicide treatments, $15, $20 per acre. It's a kind of a hard one to swallow, but again, I try to think about what did it do for me a year after I treated, not what it does the first month, but what did it do a year after I treated. And if you put that in context, if you're mowing just for weed control, that's still costing you $15, $20, $25 per acre just to do one mowing. Other things to think about is how long we have to wait after we put on a herbicide treatment before we can seed more forages, even forage grasses. We may have some limitations as to what that time period is. The other thing to think about is be familiar with the herbicide products you're using. Any of these aminopyrrolide based products, for example, are going to have this diagram, because that treated area, whether it be grasses that are directly consumed by the animals or through hay or whatever, if that residue ends up either through the manure or through the composted or through the hay that ends up being composted and used on sensitive crops, there can be problems. In fact, a few years ago, went too far. I was asked to look at a situation where this organic vegetable producer was acquired some hay bales that were at least 2 or 3 years old, and then he used that as a mulch on some of his vegetable plants. Well, lo and behold, this grass hay had been treated with an aminopyrrolide type product, and that aminopyrrolide is still there until it gets wet and moist and then starts breaking down. So be aware of that, particularly if you're using aminopyrrolide producing hay on hay fields, that there are some limitations on where that end product needs to be utilized. Basically, best fits permanent grass pastures is the best fit for the aminopyrrolide type herbicides. I just want to quickly mention we have a herbicide and want to make an application. There are some areas may have commercial applicators, but a lot of times we're going to do that ourselves. Certainly a boom type sprayer works best for a good uniform spread across the area we want to spray. But we have these booms. One of the dilemmas we have, I know here in Kentucky and West Virginia, the same way. We got to go around trees. We have fence lines that we'd like to get up against, and we got to be careful about how those booms are operated. But they work best for laying down a uniform pattern. Now we have these boomless type sprayers where you may have a single nozzle or cluster of nozzles in which we can utilize these to a spray pattern. The only caution about that is we're hopefully using large droplets, because if we're spraying that up into the air, then there's more prone possibility of those droplets being windborne and moving off target. So we've got to be aware that we're operating those appropriately. And again, for products that are used in pints and quarts per acre, this probably works pretty well. Products that are used in ounces per acre, we may lose some of our uniformity. Now, the other thing I put in here is an ATV mounted with a sprayer, side by sides as well. I think one of the things that's been very useful on the farms now is being able to utilize these units, the spot spray areas, or for small broadcasting areas for weed control, we have a lot of utility. So anyway, there's some different ways we can make that application. Now, to finish up here, I want to talk about some specific issues, but first of all, talk about what we can do right now as far as targeting weeds, particularly targeting weeds with herbicides, these cool season plants, things like poison hemlock, the thistles, the biennial thistles, that is, buttercup and chicory. When these plants are young and just starting their active growth here in the late winter, early spring, is our best opportunity to get the best activity if we're going to use a herbicide. The downside is sometimes they're hard to find. We have to look for them, or we have to know where the areas are where we had the problem in the previous year. Of course, the other option we have here in the spring is we may need to do some interseeding. And that may be the better choice than doing the spring, where we try to do some interseeding to thicken up the stands of the desirable forages so that they can create more of a competitive edge. But I know that can be a challenge sometimes of trying to get that accomplished. And then if it depends on how thick that stand is, we may have summer annuals that can be something we have to work with as we go through the summer months. But anyway, those are in general some things I think that we can do. And having said that, I want to go through some examples now of some specific weed problems. And I don't know how widespread this spring wildflower is in your state, but at least in Kentucky, this is getting much more and more of a foothold in our state. And I can pretty much guarantee you this is a grazed pasture. But this yellow plant, many of you may be familiar with it already, is buttercup. And this is usually what we start seeing in May or late April or April on to early May. There's some fields that are dominated by buttercup. And if you look real close, the buttercups, oftentimes, at least the species that are more common in pasture fields, have these bright yellow flower petals. Usually there's 5, which are associated with the buttercups. But I don't know how well you can see it, but when you have this much flowers out in the field, that much growth on flowers, you already have seed being produced. In fact, inside that cluster of flower petals is seed. And that individual flower may only produce 30 to 40 seed per head. But can you count the number of flowers that's out in that field? Lots of seed being produced. And that's the problem, I think, with a weed like buttercup. It might be a few plants the first year, and then within a couple of years, we have a whole field dominated by a plant like buttercup. There's some different species, and one of the challenges on the buttercups in the vegetative growth stages, the leaf shapes can vary somewhat, and maybe a little more of a challenge to figure out that it is a buttercup until you do see flowers. But if you've had it in the previous years, I can assure you, if you go and look now, you'll find buttercup now. We can mow, but in general, some probably more ineffective than not, because a lot of those flowers and seed are produced below that cutter bar, and we're certainly not going to get all the seed, but we might reduce the amount of seed being produced. I think the big thing is culture practices. Again, establishing and maintaining good pasture stands. Particularly, we have an open field like the one in this photo. It's probably worthwhile to do something other to correct the forage stand as a more long-term strategy to control the buttercup. Herbicides, take your pick. 2,4-D works as well as anything. And right now, March through early April, we want to be on that and making those applications. In fact, here's some data from a colleague of mine a few years ago, looking at 2,4-D and Weedmaster Crossbow, and then Cimarron, which is the sulfuron. Excellent results, even at low rates of 2,4-D. So this plant is highly sensitive to the herbicide options that we have available to us. And it's not difficult to control that with herbicides if we choose to. But I think this next slide to me illustrates the importance of cultural practices. Obviously, here in the foreground is a hayfield. We have a lot of vegetative cover. In fact, as you get close to this fence, you'll be hard pressed to even find buttercup. But once you cross over the fence into this field area, which was used for winter grazing, we have lots of buttercup, which helps illustrate that this plant's not very competitive or not susceptible to germination if you have good cover. But when we remove that cover by grazing, and granted, we're going to have areas we need to feed during the winter months, but that's where these kind of weeds are going to be much more problematic to deal with. correcting this problem, if feasible, would go a long way to trying to minimize the problem. Moving on to some of the other cool season weeds, or weeds that flower more towards spring, early summer. The musk or nodding thistle we still have it. We don't have as much, I think, as we used to. I think it's a little bit of a success story. The population has been reduced. But again, the time of year to spray these thistles here, February, March, back when these plants in their young rosette stage, that's the preferred time to use herbicides. Now, if we want to mow after they bolt or after the flower stalks emerge, and just as those flowers begin to open, is probably the key time to get the most benefit from mowing. Now, another option on the table is this thistlehead weevil, which is a biological control agent. And this was released in Kentucky back in the mid-70s. And even the highway department collected insects and spread them along our highways. This insect by itself has not fully allowed us to get rid of musk thistle, but it has helped quite a bit. And what happens is these adults, they land on the developing flower heads, lay their eggs, and as the eggs hatch, the larvae burrow down into the head and eat out the seed. So the bottom line for these biennial thistles, for control biennial thistles, don't let them produce seed. Whether you're getting help from the insect, if you're mowing at the right time, or using herbicides so the plant doesn't to grow into the point where it can produce flowers, is the key for the long-term reduction of a plant like musk thistle. Now, another plant that's life cycle is very similar to musk or the biennial thistles, and this is another plant classified as a biennial, and just like the musk or nodding thistle, I think it grows in Kentucky as much as a winter annual, because a lot of times it starts germinating back in September, early October. And then this is what we see as we move into June. A tall plant, lots of white flowers. In fact, this plant was introduced, as I understand, as an ornamental in the northeastern part of the US. And that's pretty typical of poison hemlock plant. But this is what it looks like right now. It's a rosette on the ground, has no hairs on the leaf, in their leaf petios. That usually you can start seeing some spotting even on the leaf petios when these plants are pretty young. But here in March, April, as the temperatures start to warm, that's the best time to use herbicide treatments. 2,4-D can work pretty well on these younger plants. To get much growth on them, then we might have to use something else to do a little bit better job. Now, this is one of those plants, as I mentioned earlier, is we need to get those animals out of those areas before we spray the herbicides. And I've seen a couple cases where poison hemlock plants were sprayed in the spring when the plants were about knee high, and then those animals were more susceptible to graze those plants when normally they leave it alone. And but that can be a precaution if we have potentially poisonous plants in those areas that we want to spray. This is a picture I took between Christmas and New Year's a few years ago, and this plant is one of those vegetative plants that goes what I consider semi during the winter months. Yeah, we might get the leaves burnt back a little bit by hard cold spells, but if you'll know where the areas were the previous year, you're going to find a lot of this green growth and this plant actively growing. And this is extending about 50, 60 feet out away from the road, fence line area near the road, in which this is a pretty heavy population of poison hemlock. And that's what we need to do something about it. Now, moving on to some examples of summer annual weeds. Here's common cocklebur. Common cocklebur is, again, a summer annual. Starts to germinate, maybe in late April, but usually in May. And then active vegetative growth is May, June, July. And then it starts reproducing in August. And it's about mid-August, early to mid-August, we start seeing the development of the fruit or the burrs on the plant. And for the most part, this is not a prolific seed producer. Now, you may have, on a fully mature plant, you may have a few hundred burrs, but relatively speaking, it's not as prolific of a seed producer as some other weeds that we have. This happens to be a field I worked in a couple of years ago, which is a winter feeding area for animals. And this following summer, whenever I was asked to look at this field, it was covered up in cocklebur and as well as common ragweed. So I initiated a trial wanting to evaluate the sharpen that I mentioned earlier, as well as permit. These two herbicides are non-growth regulators, or non-synthetic auxin herbicides, different type chemistries. Compared to using 2,4-D by itself or with Weed Master, Graze on Next, as well as Pasture Guard. And I use Pasture Guard instead of Crossbow because I wanted non-2,4-D herbicide in that mix. So this was my treatments, and which we looked at. And again, I wanted to compare how about could we use a product like Sharpen in the middle of the summer where we don't have to be as concerned about volatility loss as we do with some of these other herbicide products. And the control that we saw, and these were applied in mid-June, cockleberry about 6 to 12 inches tall. And we can see the Sharpen here was as effective as 2,4-D, Weed Master, and Graze on Next. Permit also did an acceptable job. We had a few escapes out of the Permit treatment, but all these herbicides worked pretty well. The one that was a little bit surprising is Pasture Guard was certainly the weakest herbicide in that mix. We also mowed as another treatment in August. And the reason the control was less here, we did greatly reduce the amount of new stems or seed being produced on those plants, but there was still some green growth is the reason why that got evaluated down around 70%. But mowing was also effective, but not nearly as effective as using a herbicide. Here's what Weed Master looks like, pretty typical growth regulator symptomology, and this is about 14 days after the treatment. We get this curling, growth and leaf curling and the stem twisting that's associated with the growth regulator type herbicides. On the other hand, Sharpen burns the leaves of plants. It's a contact type herbicide. So we had more of a leaf burn associated with that particular herbicide. And it was tank mixed with methylated seed oil as an adjuvant, which is an important part of adding to that leaf burn that we're trying to get with the herbicide like Sharpen. Just a quick overview of Sharpen. It's a contact herbicide, a PPO inhibitor. It is going to help us on annual broadleaf weeds, and I want to especially emphasize annuals, things like cockleburr, the ragweeds, maybe pigweeds. I haven't had a chance to look at it on pigweeds yet. It's a fairly low use rate. Tank mixed with methylated seed oil. The cost of this product is pretty comparable to 2,4-D on a cost per acre basis. The sticker shock is when you buy a gallon goes a long way. So you can get almost 100 acres or over 100 acres at 1 ounce per acre rate. There are no grazing or hay restrictions, so we don't have any problems of having to wait after applying before we can use that area. But I do want to emphasize it's not going to control perennial weed species. So if we have a field that has some perennial weeds, then we're going to need some additional help besides just Sharpen. There was some ragweed in the field as well. So the Sharpen, the Weed Master, the Graze on Next, all performed extremely well for the control of this common ragweed. Again, applied June 15th on 6 to 12 inch tall ragweed. What was a little surprised, but not too surprising, 2,4-D is a little bit weaker, as well as Pasture Guard, if we're going after common ragweed as our primary species. The permit was even less than that. But as far as the Sharpen doing as well as these other two herbicides, it was as effective for targeting weeds that are a foot tall or less. Here's kind of what it looks like. The Sharpen. Here's an untreated borders on each side of these plots. And as you can see, we have a lot of green growth here. Looks a lot better than what we have, and I'll show you here in a minute. But we did have some perennials. I think it was ground cherry that was in this field that did come back. It burnt the leaves off initially, but they did regrow. Here's what an untreated area looked like. So you see all the cockleburr and the ragweed. It's hard to tell where the grasses are in this field because of the pressure of the weeds that are at the site. And again, this was previously used during the wintertime for winter feeding area. Here's Weed Master. Again, good control, excellent control of all the broadleaf weeds, including some of the perennials that were in there, and then as well as Graze on Next. Again, good control for broadleaf weeds, but here's our dilemma. you look real close, you'll see seed heads of foxtail, and then there's some crabgrass as well. So what happened is we took out the broadleaf weed competition. We still had a lot of open bare areas, and then here came all these weedy grasses. So I'm not sure how to resolve that situation, other than we've got to do something to improve the overall stand of the desirable forages in this field to minimize this. But these herbicides are going to target the broadleaf weeds, but it may release some of the weedy grasses as well. So the main point is on these summer annual weeds, and this is not the best slide to illustrate this, but where we have a lot of these annual plants show up in these fields, to me, are indicators. Oftentimes are indicators that we have some open bare spots in those fields that allows those plants to do well. And that's part of the overall long-term equation, is how do we minimize a lot of those open bare spots for those weeds to take advantage of. I want to quickly go through a couple more examples of some weeds here. Another one that you often see is spiny amaranth or spiny pigweed. Another summer annual weed, and as I showed you this photo earlier, shows up a lot of times around these feeding areas, and it thrives where that manure is being laid down. It likes those extra nutrients it gets, and these things comes up by the thousands. Now they'll self-thin themselves to a certain extent, but the problem with spiny amaranth or the pigweeds, they're prolific seed producers, much more so than cocklebur and ragweed. So you have hundreds of thousands of seed, and a lot of those seed are being produced down here where the spines are. It's another summer annual. Growth period is basically the same as the cocklebur and the ragweed. The one difference is, though, this one does start its reproductive phase a little bit earlier than the cocklebur and the ragweed does. In fact, this thing can start producing flowers even, I think, into July. Early July, you'll start seeing at least the male flowers, and then you can have seed. As far as control, I don't know of a silver bullet to get rid of this one per se in these heavily feeding areas, because it's there. But we've somehow or another, if we could prevent new seed production, improve our forage growth, that would help us a lot to reduce the presence of this weed. As far as mowing, that's another one of those tongue-in-cheek. Yes, it may reduce some top growth. That some of you know, you cut off the top of this plant and it just grows prostrate. But if we want to use mowing, we need to do that maybe a couple different times to start clipping this plant off when we first start seeing the flowers begin to develop. Herbicide wise, we can choose pretty much any of those herbicides and be effective, but we need to be doing it again back in May, June, early July, when this plant's in its vegetative growth stage to be most effective. I did a little demo a few years ago. Here's 2,4-D, Weed Master, Graze on Next. If you look at the border areas of each of those plots, this is where the spiny amaranth is in full growth, late summer. And we did a pretty good job of keeping those weed at bay throughout the year, but just one application. But again, the timeliness is what's important, and learning to recognize this plant when it's young. Now, this may be a little bit too young, but when you start seeing these seedling plants emerge in May, it doesn't take but a few weeks where you have a pretty good sized plant. So we can go quickly from this growth stage to a plant that might be a foot tall in a fairly short period of time. But that's when we need to target these plants if we want to use herbicide as an option. If not, then we need to mow those off the best we can, realizing that we're not going to get all of it because it's going to go prostrate on us. But again, it's like all other annual weeds. It's a numbers game. We want to reduce new seed production. Now I want to switch over to another plant that we see throughout the summer, especially in the fall of the year, and that's the tall ironweed. In some ways you might call it our fall wildflower here in Kentucky because it has a nice, pretty purple bloom. It can be on upland sites, or it can be in low wet areas, out in these pastures, along fence rows and so forth. But this is a true perennial because it can reproduce by seed. and they're wind-blown seed, maybe not as wind-blown as a dandelion seed and some of the other plants in the same plant family, but they are wind-blown, as well as those root buds, because we have this cluster of roots that are growing in these plants that once they get a foothold, and we come in and we cut that off, where we had one stem, now we have 3 or so stems that emerge. And to kind of summarize this quickly, this is kind of my control protocol, if you will. And this is based upon a number of different studies I've done over the last 20 years on tall ironweed. And I showed you some data a little bit earlier in the field that had tall ironweed. And this is what we did. We came in and mowed those those pastures in mid to late summer, basically July, if I had to put a month on it. We're going to let that first flush of tall ironweed come up. Of course, they're going to, if it's being grazed, those stems are going to be worn down by the cattle and other activities. But we're going to clip that off, and we're going to force that plant to use up some of its root reserve to produce a new shoot. Some young tender shoots, when they get about 12, 20 inches tall, that's when we want to make the herbicide application. Now, some people will spread it midsummer, but I think my success of a number of different studies has been 85 to 90% reduction in the population, even more so in some cases, if we go through this program. And by mowing, we're going to force the plant to use up root reserves. And then by spraying here in late summer, there's more likelihood we're going to get more herbicide movement down into that root system. And a lot of times for a lot of perennials, I'm going to recommend more of a late summer to fall application to achieve more herbicide movement downward in these perennials. Products that work best are products that contain triclopure, that's crossbow pasture guard, or aminopurulid, and things like Grazon, Next, and Duracore in our area. Now, if I want to see clover the next spring, I'm probably going to lean more towards triclopure. Not that we can't do it sometimes, but there's less risk of carryover injury with triclopure than there is with aminopurulid, depending on when we made that application and the weather conditions that occur during that previous 6 months. But anyway, the point is, this is a program that's worked pretty well, I think, at least in our area, in a number of cases I've been involved with. I had one failure one year. We sprayed mid-September. Temperatures had dropped down to the low 50s, and we didn't get as good results. But so the timing of this is important, that we get this done pretty quick as we move into that fall, because this plant goes south pretty quick, and we've got to have some active growth to get the results we need. Now, having said that, one of the other application methods that people ask about is using rope wicks and roto-wiper applicators, particularly on a tall plant such as tall ironweed. We had a graduate student that did some work a few years back where she looked at Roundup, which is typically used in these rope wicks, at a 50% solution, half water, half Roundup Weather Max, and then Milestone, which is what's in Grazon, the aminopurulid, the straight aminopurulid, at 1, 10, and a 20% solution by volume, and then Remedy, which is a straight triclopure, which is what's in Crossbow, at a 20% mix. And then compare that to a broadcast application of Forefront, or this was the old formulation, let's just call it Grazon, if you will, as a broadcast treatment. The rest of these treatments were put on with a rope wick. 4 weeks after treatment, the control ranged from about 83% up to about 95% control. And she saw some statistical differences among those values, although there's not much difference in control that I see here. So anything above 80% I would have thought was pretty good. As far as seeing some suppression, or at least activity occurring on those tall ironweed plants with all those treatments. This is 4 weeks after treatment. The ultimate question is, what did it do a year after? Well, the Roundup dropped off to 34% control. Milestone was at 28, bumped up to about 67% control at the 20% solution, and Remedies at 22% control. Whereas the broadcast application was still hanging in there about 85 to almost 90%. So the broadcast treatment is certainly far superior than using the rope wick applicator. This was one site. Just to give you some other numbers to look at, same treatments, but now we have 3 broadcast treatments the graze on our forefront, pasture guard, and crossbow. And the control 1 year after treatment with Roundup was at 50%. Again, 63% milestone, 20%, which is similar to what she saw at the other site, as well as the Triclopure treatment. But these broadcast treatments were above 70% control. Now, these numbers are pretty variable, so it's kind of hard to visualize that. This may be the actual cost of a broadcast treatment on a per acre basis. It's hard to calculate exactly how much it costs to use these rope wicks or these wipers, but keep in mind, if you just mix up 3 gallons, a lot depending on how far can you go with that, that's still could be a pricey treatment if you have a thick stand of some of those weeds you're trying to wipe. So the concept of these wipers and rope wicks, I think, is kind of an interesting and intriguing concept, but I don't see the results that we'd like to get as far as we're being real serious about the control that we're looking for, particularly with we want to use them when we have real dense stands of these weeds. They're not going to be as beneficial. On the other hand, if we had thin stands of, let's say, tall ironweed, I think I'd prefer just do some spot treatments selectively with one of these herbicides with a spot gun and deal with them that way, maybe not having to treat the whole area as a way to minimize the cost of doing that. So kind of keeping that in mind, like I said, the concept is good. You can build those rope wicks yourself if you're a little bit inclined to do that. And the other real dilemma that I see with the rope wick applicators and so forth is, what do we do with these slopes? As you go across, you want to go up and down the slope. Otherwise, if you have a long wick, you're going to have a lot more solution at the bottom of the wick than you do at the top, and you may have damage on one end and no control on the other end. So that's kind of where I'm at on the rope wick applicators. I want to finish up with these comments here, and then I'll take some questions. Just to kind of summarize, the best time of the year to apply herbicides, if we want to use that as a tool, well, it starts when you have to know your weeds. And that's true even for any control tactic that we utilize. It's not just knowing, and I'm not to say that you'd have to become extremely knowledgeable on all the weeds that you're dealing with, because the county extension offices can help you out to help identify some of these plants. But become familiar with their life cycle. When are they growing and actively growing? Particularly when are they in the vegetative growth stages? What do they look like? Not necessarily when they're in full flower, but what do they look like when they're younger? And keeping in mind that herbicides usually work best on actively growing weeds, particularly those that are younger, especially those annual species that we're dealing with. So in the spring of the year, I've talked about it already, or even in late fall, these cool season weeds, that's a good time to target those plants. Is something we can be doing here in the next few days as we begin to warm up back up into the mid 50s to 60s for daytime highs and low 40s. That's when these cool season plants are actively growing. In fact, I saw some henbit today that was in bloom. So these winter annuals are beginning to do their thing as far as their final stages of growth. Midsummer, things like cocklebur, ragweed, spiny amaranth, these are more midsummer weeds to deal with. Some are annuals especially. And then, as I mentioned and alluded to, and this is not true for every species, but these perennial species, I try to encourage people to wait till late summer to early fall to target those, when we can potentially get more herbicide into the root system of those plants. So with that said, I'm going to stop there, and then if we have some questions, we'll try to address those.
All right, thank you. Yes, there are quite a few questions. Start here.
Let me stop sharing on my screen so I can see some of them. Or do you want to read them? Or
No, you go ahead. If you want to go through them, that's great, because then you can.
Let me start here at the top. First one was asking about, are familiar with Kathy Balth and her working with training cattle to eat weeds. Yes, I'm a little bit familiar with that. And she's showing some results of getting some animals to eat some of those plants that we call weeds. In fact, there are weedy plants that we have that are common, like crabgrass, and even chicory that's being seeded as a forage crop. And they have forage value. In fact, if an animal will eat it, eat some of these weeds in their own young vegetative growth stage, they can do that. But the difficulty I see in our environment, in our area, and I would say West Virginia is the same as Kentucky, is if animals have a choice, they're going to take what they want and leave what they don't want. And I don't think you'll ever get them quite trained to eat all those weedy type plants that's out there. If so, we'd be having animals eating a lot more and not leaving as many of those weedy plants behind. Next question about what height do you recommend for cutting hay? I'm not a forage specialist, but certainly, you know, the main point I wanted to make with that is just don't scalp it off at the ground. Leave some growth there at the base of those plants, for those tillers to get reestablished and the root system not to be stressed as they regrow. So, you know, that may be 4 inches, could be 6 inches, depending on the specific grass species that, and I realize that we want to take off as much as possible because we want to maximize our effort. But anyway, it's you know, that's kind of depends on the species specifically is what that may relate to. Someone made a comment about chicory makes good coffee. Yes, I've heard of that. Anyway, question about common and control of broom sedge in hayfields. Broom sedge is one of those grasses. It's a perennial warm season grass. Then here in a few weeks, you're obviously going to see where it is. I think broom sedge is the more work that's been done on broom sedge. It seems to be as much of an indication that things are out of balance as far as the desirable the nutrients for the desirable species. In fact, there's been some more recent work done here in Kentucky where they're just adding potash on a field that was limited in potash was helpful to shift more back towards tall fescue and less towards broom sedge. And I reviewed a paper a few years back that they didn't necessarily get rid of the broom sedge, but they certainly allowed better growth of desirable species by just correcting the nutrients that were available for that for the desirable species to grow. Now, having said that, I know that also broom sedge grows on some pretty rocky or areas that are less desirable, and you're not going to be able to correct that as well. Says, can sharpen be used on buttercup? I did a little trial last spring, and I was disappointed that sharpen didn't help us out on the buttercup. Burnt the leaves back, but it didn't do much as far as control. The other comment I'll make about sharpen, though, there was some clover in that field, and the clover came through it. I mean, again, maybe had a little bit of leaf burn on it, but it did come back. Question that comes up every time I speak: how do we deal with Johnson grass in these hay fields? Well, typically you won't find or pasture fields where typically you don't find much Johnson grass in a grazed pasture field. And that's because cattle are utilizing it as a forage. It was introduced in this country as a forage crop. And as such, it can provide forage. But in a hay field, we're cutting hay year after year. It just continues to get more and more problematic in those fields that are maintained as grass hay. It's not an issue in your first cutting. Again, Johnson grass is a warm season grass. So when we take that first cutting of hay off, usually in May, maybe early June, that's when Johnson grass is just starting to grow. And then we get into July and August, September, and it loves those hot days, and it becomes much more prolific. And I think one of the problems is, even if we're trying to be somewhat timely in those second cuttings of hay, oftentimes they're not cut until the seed is already being produced, and we're just keep spreading it around. So the point is continuous grass hay production is going to continue to propagate the problem. Now, having said that, I don't have a silver bullet as far as a chemical control, but some things to think about. If it's a field that has fencing and has a supply of water, and if you're running some cattle or you have access to cattle, one option to think about is going ahead and cutting the first cutting of hay like you normally do, knowing it's not an issue in that first cutting, but turn the animals in there the rest of the, after you get the regrowth, just let the animals graze it the rest of the year. And that's not a 1-year fix. It's something you do year after year until those animals, because since they continuously graze, in fact, I've had individuals say they selectively graze the Johnson grass over the other cool season grasses. And they'll selectively graze and help decrease the rhizome, at least the rhizome population in those fields. You'll never totally get rid of the seed once it's gotten established, but you can work on reducing the population that way for a period of time if you've got the resources to do that. Some of the hay fields we have in Kentucky are pretty decent soils and could be rotated to a grain crop for a few years. And if you could do that, then maybe rotate into a grain crop for a few years to use some of our other herbicide tools that we can use in grain crops. Maybe another way to help that situation. That's a difficult one. Going back to grazing it, make sure you get those animals off that field though before frost, because Johnson grass can be toxic at certain times whenever it's in stressed conditions such as a frost. Control of horse nettle. Horse nettle is a perennial, another perennial. Unfortunately, horse nettle has a network of roots in the ground. And there is no herbicide that I consider highly effective on horse nettle. Sort of the best herbicides are the aminopyrrolid based products, things like Grazon, and I understand Duracor can, which has aminopyrrolid in as well, can help us. Some results that I've had myself, I would say it's been averaged about 65 to 70% control, maybe 80% control in some fields, but as far as the year after the application. But it's something you got to work on for 2 or 3 years because you can't get enough herbicide through that network of roots that's underground. It's kind of like Canada thistle. It's the roots under the ground that's the big challenge. What do you do to control milkweed and hemp dogbane? As regards to milkweed, those herbicides that I've listed there are not very effective on milkweed, at least common milkweed. So if you've got a serious milkweed problem, the only herbicide we can use in grazed pasture fields would be glyphosate or Roundup and the spot treatment, but unfortunately that kills the desirable grasses. As far as hemp dogbane, which looks a lot like milkweed, but it's a totally different species, your triclopyr-based herbicides can work pretty well on hemp dogbane, but again, trying to time it to get the best uptake into the plant is part of the key to that. What about managing foxtail? You're asking me all these questions I tried to avoid tonight. That's another real dilemma because foxtail, even though it's a summer annual, it can be just as problematic as having Johnson grass in some, particularly in hay, because as mentioned here, the horses are sensitive, and particularly those heads can be problematic. The first thing I would say about foxtail issues is if you're seeing a lot of foxtail in these fields, again, that may, as an annual, that may be a little bit of an indication you have a lot of open bare spots, for one. But secondly, I also know it's another one of those weeds is it really doesn't come in and start growing until we take that first cut in the hay off. And again, when we remove that top growth of that hay and get that off the ground and allow sunlight to hit the ground, I'm afraid that's when the foxtail starts germinating and becomes problematic. And that gets to be a little bit of a dilemma. Now, having said that, we do have Prowl H2O and similar formulations that can be used now in grass hay fields. But I'm afraid the timing on that's going to be a challenge because the way that herbicide works, it has to be on the ground before those seeds germinate. It doesn't do anything to control emerged weeds. So that's a real challenge, and I'm not so sure to use it on a wide scale yet. I'm not sure I would recommend that at this point in time, but just try it on a smaller basis to see if that can work for you. Will you lose all your clover if you use milestone to control knapweed? It's fall time, best time to spray. Yes, unfortunately, milestone or the aminopyrrolate herbicides are highly effective on clover. Now, having said that, that's the clover that's up and growing. Now, clover is kind of a hard-seeded plant. I've had some longer term trials that the first year after treatment, you can't find clover. But as you went into the second year, I started to see a little bit of volunteer clover come up in some of those plots. So, with time, you could have some clover come up behind that. But if that's the herbicide you need to control some of these tougher weeds, then we may have to forego the clover for a little while until we can get their weed problem at bay, and then we can reintroduce the clovers later on. Question here about control of sweet Annie. I'm a little bit not sure what plant we're talking about there. Maybe something I'm familiar with. I'm just haven't heard called sweet Annie before. So wants to follow up on that. Can fire have an effect with weed treatments, especially with prolific seed producers, to burn up the seed? Maybe seed that's on the plant still, that might help some, but I'm not going to be much of an advocate for using fire, particularly for seed that's in the soil. I just don't think you're going to get enough heat there for the most part to have much of an impact. Question about what is the best herbicide or killer for buttercup? Again, as I mentioned earlier, 240 I think works as well as anything. I've been successful about just using 240 if I can do that back in March. Multiflora rose treatment. There's a number of different herbicides that are effective on multiflora rose. Certainly crossbow, the triclopyr-based herbicides work pretty well. The aminopyrrolate herbicides work pretty well. The key to it is, and as well as just spot spraying with glyphosate or Roundup. The key to that is spraying them whenever they're right at flowering stage, or right after flowering stage is probably to get the best benefit from a foliar application. Now, having said that, it's been several years ago. There's what's called a basal bark treatment or basal treatment that you can use and go out right now, here in March, before the leaves start coming out, and you spray the lower portion of the stem of the stems. You don't have to spray the whole plant, but you're taking straight herbicide out of the jug and just walking around and spraying the lower part of those stems. Okay, someone clarified this. Sweet Annie is Artemisia or wormwood. I think that's pretty similar, like mugwort. That's a perennial. There's not any good options there for that one that I know of. Again, you've got a perennial root system, is what you're dealing with. I think mowing and then trying to do something in the fall might be your best shot at it. But I probably just don't have any good answers for that one. What about autumn olive? Actually, for things like autumn olive and some of those woody type plants, I'm leaning, as far as out in pasture fields, I sort of like the pasture guard as a foliar treatment, particularly late summer, when we still have some active leaf growth, but before the little plants begin to senesce, and that would be the preferred time to target some of these woody plants like autumn olive. Okay, yes, the loss of connection when I was talking about broom sedge. Can I re-summarize what I said? So broom sedge, as a perennial grass, it really boils down, I think, to correcting the soil fertility needs of the site if it's feasible. There's been some work to show that, even if potash is deficient at a site or phosphorus is deficient in a field, then by correcting those to allow the desirable cool season grasses to have a more competitive advantage, has shown to as a way to kind of shift the growth more towards a desirable species. And then certainly don't let it produce seed. Get it mowed or clipped in late fall, early spring to reduce seed production, and doing those things to kind of shift it more towards a desirable species. Can I suggest a product for mare's tail control? There's pretty much any of those herbicides will work on mare's tail if you'll catch it when it's young. So here in the early spring would be the best time to do that. And again, 2,4-D, and I assume we're talking about pasture fields. 2,4-D would be better. Can work pretty well, but use the higher rates. Was the Weed Master dicamba 2,4-D mixes, and even Sharpen. And that's what we're mainly using, Sharpen to control mare's tail and soybean. But it has to be small. We can't let it, start producing a lot of top growth before we do those treatments.
I've got a question that was direct message to me. A big problem with Perella mint and horse pasture. Have spot sprayed and pulled for years, but making no progress. Have followed local extension recommendations with no good results. They say they're aware Perella mint is toxic to cattle and horses, and would love your advice.
Yeah, if there's an upside to Perella mint, it's an annual. And probably more often than not, I see it at the edges, partially shaded areas of the field. You'll sometimes see it out in the field, but partially shaded areas where you can't get to very easily. If it is an area that you could get to easily, certainly just trying to mow and clip it off before it produces seed each year would be a plus. Herbicide wise, I was kind of looking at that guide, that publication that they sent you a link to, has Perella mint on it. It looks like our 2,4-D herbicide alone is not very good on it. We've got to get into the crossbows, graze on to get the best results, but it's not. We need to try to catch it when it's young in midsummer and not when it's in full bloom.
All right, I think that, does anyone else have any more questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Greene, for all the great information. We appreciate you coming here tonight. And I forgot to mention earlier that these webinars will be recorded. We're working on getting through the editing process right now, and they'll be posted on the WVU website, and we'll share that link with all the participants when we get that completed.
Okay. Well, thank you all for the opportunity. I always enjoy talking about this topic. I feel like I get a lot of enjoyment. I prefer to do them in person because I get a lot better feedback and be able to even learn from the participants and things that have worked for them, things that have not worked for them. So again, my goal tonight was not to have all the answers for you. I'm just trying to share some nuggets, and you've got a lot of challenges and sometimes things are easier said than to implement, and I understand that, but hopefully you can use a few of those nuggets to maybe improve upon the situation you already are working with.
Thank you, Dr. Greene.